Welcome to the podcast about podcasting from True Story FM. I'm Pete Wright.
Hi, I'm Andy Nelson.
We need to talk about tracking and analytics, specifically services today. Can we do that?
Yes, please. I'd love to talk about this because changes are afoot.
Changes are afoot. I got an email late last week, from our friends at Chartable. What do you know about Chartable? Do you know anything about Chartable as a company besides how we use it?
Other than how we use it, I guess I don't know a whole lot about Chartable, but I do know we get periodic, like weekly updates from Chartable listing like chart positions for different shows. Mm-hmm. They give us, if there were comments on Apple Podcasts, that gets listed there too. So that's kind of my sense of Chartable.
Yeah, and that's pretty much what it is. And like so many companies that are in our space, and you know, in the tech space, obviously, I'm not saying anything new here. They were founded, they were spun up out of necessity. These a couple of guys behind the podcast Hacker Daily. They're brilliant technologists, and they really wanted to get better data on their podcasts. So they were looking for a service that actually gave aggregated podcast data across all these services, Apple Podcasts and Pocket Casts and Stitcher. And all of those companies at the time had some level of tracking data. Not all of them. Most of them had some level of tracking data, but they were only tracking their own app's performance, like links that when you play a podcast on Stitcher, that would count. But you as the podcaster would have to go to each place and then add it all up. So they wanted to create this tool that would allow you to see all in one place. And all you'd have to do is add a little bit of code to the beginning of your URLs in your podcast feed, and it would just automatically pass through Chartable's tracking gate. And right. It was great. And since then, there are a bunch of other services that kind of spun up and did it, and they've all, had some degree of differentiation. But Chartable is really one of the big ones, and that it impacts us because Chartable was the service that we were using. In 2000, it was founded in 2018. In 2019, they actually got into marketing tracking, and they introduced a feature called Smart Links, which was a tool to measure effectiveness of clickable or tappable media in marketing campaigns, and Smart Promos that offered insights for podcast to podcast marketing. So podcasters in a great grand collective could market against one another's shows. Very, very useful. And it really helped Chartable grow. In fact, they grew a ton. In 2020, they reported 1 billion podcast tracked downloads. Woof. And ad impressions monthly, up from 100 million downloads earlier that year. Wow. In September of 2020, the company raised $2.25 million in seed funding. So they're growing fast. And what happens when they grow fast? Well, they become a target for acquisition. And I say mournfully, I'll say it again, sadly and mournfully, in February of 2022, Spotify acquired Chartable when Spotify was acquiring everything to grow their podcasting business, and said, don't worry, Chartable's awesome. We're not going to change a thing.
Spotify seems to say that a lot, right? Yeah.
And they promptly changed things. They changed a lot of things, but largely Chartable was still a really useful tracking service, and we continued to use it, and I think a lot of podcasters continued to use it fairly zealously, even under Spotify's leadership. 2 years go by, cut to 2 years later, just last week, Spotify announced the closure of Chartable as part of their company's refocus. So, like many things in the industry, changes happen, sometimes fast, and Spotify recognized that its egregious spend in the podcast industry was maybe required a little bit of realignment, retargeting. And effective December 12th, 2024, Chartable goes dark.
Yeah.
Okay. So Chartable goes dark. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the impact of that for those who use Chartable for tracking, because, there are a lot of reasons to use Chartable for tracking, and to use a aggregated podcast tracking service. One of those is advertisers, right? People who are buying ads against your show, they want to see how your downloads are doing, not just in Apple Podcasts or the aforementioned Spotify, but across the entire show. How are your downloads? And having a tool that allows us to see that data easily, quickly, to see our first 7 days, first 30 days, first 60 days, 90 days data is useful. Many podcast hosts actually do a lot of this tracking. But I find that having a second set of data actually helps us to rationalize the first, right? We know that a transistor FM gives us fantastic data, and it's also very, very fast generally. But it's also nice to have Chartable to be able to tell us how we're doing, against other shows and in the broader market.
Right. In the world of other podcasts.
Yeah.
Because that's what we don't get from Transistor. Transistor is great to know, like, this is how many episodes were downloaded last week. But where does that compare with all of the other comparable episodes from other shows?
Right. So that is definitely an issue. From a data continuity and I'll say a workflow perspective, there will be disruption, I think, come December, right? Because we're going to have to figure out how to sort of cross the transom of one company going dark while bringing up another service. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But part of the challenge is we have a giant show database of all of our episodes, of all the shows we've ever done. And in that database, we capture the direct MP3 links for our shows. And those MP3 links include the Chartable tracking code. So when we have to share those links somewhere, it will. Anybody who listens by way of that link will actually count as a tracked listen through Chartable. That'll have to that disrupts our legacy shows in our database, right? We'll have to figure out how we want to clean that up. Especially because all the alternative services do exactly the same thing. You have to replace the tracking code with another pass-through code. And at this point, I don't know how that will impact us because I don't have a statement from Spotify or from Chartable, I'll say Spotify, that says, we're going to take that prefix that is in all of your downloads and we're going to turn it off, or we're going to leave it on indefinitely to give you a chance to actually leave that on. So it'll just be dead. It'll be a pass-through that'll go straight to your new tracking service. Don't worry about it. I don't have that information yet.
I mean, knowing Spotify, I kind of have a feeling it would be the former more than the latter, but who knows?
Yeah, I know. So, the other impact on advertising and monetization, Chartables were IAB certified statistics, super valuable because, again, you could compare apples to apples, right? I often find even our own platform at Transistor is also IAB certified statistics. And it's so weird to me how these two companies can have different numbers of IAB certified statistics, right? Podcast tracking is tricky.
Yeah, right.
I don't understand why the numbers can fluctuate as much as they do. We're looking at broad trends. That's what Chartable served for us.
Yeah.
So I don't know, man. Do you generally, where does your head when it comes to these kinds of closures?
Well, it's frustrating because I think the part that you were talking about is like, how much impact is going to fall to us? Like, are we going to now have to go through, will it be a pass-through, or will we have to walk through every single episode that we have and change some of the data on the back end to modify it from Chartable to something else? Likewise, before Chartable sunsets in December 12th, do we have to make sure that we've downloaded all of our data so that we have it somewhere? Like, is it just going to shut off and disappear, or would we still have access to it? And I know they said there will be more updates in the coming weeks, so we'll have more information as we get closer to that date, but it also doesn't seem like a lot of time, right? And that's with this sort of thing, only giving 3 months lead time, less than 3 months lead time, seems pretty tight for this sort of thing. So I'd like this, in the coming weeks to really should be in the coming days to just get information out to people who are affected by it. And I think that's where it's frustrating for me because I just don't know how much work is necessarily going to be on our plate leading up to December 12th. You know, I and also just like I want to know what is going to be the alternative, and I just don't know if at this point I feel like is there an alternative to Chartable? Do you feel
Yes.
like you can get the same sort of stuff from Apple? You know?
No, that's not where I would go. And I have news. This weekend was a big learning weekend. And because all of that is true. Like, I feel like when you say days, not months, that's really important. Like, whatever choice we make, we need to turn on now so that we cover the gap. We don't want there to be any gap. And our own analytics, the analytics come from our platform host, are great. Like, I like those analytics. We're not gonna lose. I don't it would be, since Chartable has for a long time been a reference point for us. I don't necessarily think we need to worry too much about, downloading data, normalizing data across these two platforms historically. I just want to make sure we have coverage once Chartable goes away, and I'm worried about the workflow issues, making sure that all of our shows still play without the code in there. The one alternative is, and this is something you alluded to, the tools that were in Chartable, the smart promos, the marketing tools, those will stay as part of Spotify for podcasters.
Yeah.
That is Spotify's new mothership for everything that they do around podcasting. And they're really trying to get us as podcasters to be Spotify podcasters and start uploading our video directly to Spotify. Start, making sure that the hub of our podcast activity is in Spotify. I find that unpalatable. That's not the kind of podcaster I am. That's a personal choice for me. I don't care for the company. I don't care for what podcasting has done to the company. I just don't care for it. And I the same way I don't care for putting all of my eggs in Apple Podcasts basket, right? We're not Apple podcasters. We're podcasters.
Yeah. And to be I'm glad you said that. Just to clarify, when you say that, Apple has created some tools itself that also kind of move along that same path where Spotify has, where it's like, if you do this strictly through Apple, then we can give you all these great benefits. But I just think that it's important to just make sure that that's what you mean by that.
Right. It is, because we know a lot of people don't use those two platforms to listen to their podcasts. I don't use those two platforms to listen to my podcasts. And I want to make sure that my listens are also tracked somehow, right? I guess maybe that's me being an old man about podcasting, but I prefer the open nature of podcasting, and Apple and Spotify and they're working to close podcasting and make it theirs, and we're not going to do that.
Yeah, and I don't know if it warrants a conversation about the idea of like open source, but I feel like the conversation definitely leans in that direction. Like, is there room for open source, like this open source model of podcasting, or is this business shifting away from where it started?
Okay, so two things on that. First, I think, yes, there is a room for that conversation, not the least of which to talk about federated podcasting. That is a new trend, to have your podcast hosted on a federated network. And we talk about federation, we're talking about Mastodon is a federated platform alternative to Twitter. Is there a federated alternative to podcasting? I've been having conversations with people on Mastodon about just this very thing. Is there a way to make podcasting more inclusive and federated and open? Yes. And in fact, that leads me to what I think is going to be our alternative for tracking, the hope at the end of this story, which is Open Podcast Project, the Open Podcast Project as an alternative to Chartable. It is a notable alternative to Chartable. It's been around for a while. And in fact, on many of our podcasts, I turned it on inadvertently a long time ago alongside Chartable. So a lot of our podcasts already are collecting data by way of the Open Podcast Project.
It's the Open Podcast Prefix Project, right?
Yes. OP3. OP3, Open Podcast Prefix Project. Yes, right. There are 3 Ps.
Yeah.
OP.
It's a really awkward name. Let's just say that.
The Open
OP3.
Podcast Prefix Project.
Yeah.
So the whole idea for the Open Podcast Prefix Project is that it's open source, privacy focused, and it is an analytics platform for us podcasters. Its goal is to provide transparent and accessible podcast statistics. It give us those statistics. It gives us download numbers that are weirdly public by default. Like a lot of podcasters like to keep their downloads a little bit, under wraps, but Open Podcast Project actually gives you a public page for that. I don't know if there's a way for podcasters to close that or if we'd ever want to do that, but that's a piece. However, it does keep listener privacy or listener behavior private, right? It does not track any individual listener data. It only tracks like network data. It's totally free. It's accessible to podcasters at all levels, the biggest of the big to tiny startups. And it actually integrates with our service. It is made possible by a checkbox on our own service Transistor. You just check the box and it adds the appropriate code and starts tracking data through Open Podcast Prefix Project. I do like it in a lot of ways. What were you going to say?
Well, just going back to like listener privacy, like what are the other services pulling from listeners? And is this and maybe again, this might go down a road we're not wanting to go on in this particular conversation, but is that what ends up getting used for advertising?
Yeah, especially when you're looking at services like Spotify, which is that metadata, right? Like, what can it track between your podcast listens and the ads that are served to you? That's what we're really talking about. And I know Apple has a stance that often runs headlong into marketing requirements, right? They have a perspective that they talk about privacy all the time, and also, there's an option to turn off tracking, which means tracking by default is on.
Yeah.
The fact that you downloaded a podcast in Memphis is tracked. The fact that you downloaded that podcast and in Memphis and also downloaded 10 other podcasts and bought diapers that day is not tracked by the Open Podcast Prefix Project, right? That's the data that's not being, it's just network and activity around the show. So, that's useful stuff. I like that, and I like backing a project that actually has that baked in to their intent.
Yeah.
So, doesn't have all of the services that Chartable has. It doesn't do anything around consumption data, but because it's tracking at the network level, it actually gives even more data than the stuff that we already get from our host, like specific metropolitan area downloads, not just by state.
Wow.
It actually surfaces things like by city or MMA, which is also useful information. For some of our shows that are highly localized, it's nice to see that our biggest market for that show is also the show we're intending to hit.
Yeah.
Useful stuff. So that's OP3. As an alternative to Chartable, I think it is a useful thing. I'm still kind of looking. There are a bunch of other services that I think are also useful. Blueberry has an analytics service, but they're also a host, and that's really the trick. A lot of these services that give you great analytics also want you to move all your files to them too.
Yeah,
and that's not a thing that we're going to do. Services like Gumball, Podtrack, Podsites, Podscribe, Podcorn, Podkite, Podder, Podroll, Co-host, and Blueberry, they're all services that are vying for tracking attention. And so I think we're playing with the OPP, OPPP.
And just to clarify, like any of these potentially, you're essentially, the goal is you're getting the same information, whichever one you end up with. Like there should not be, in the case of this sort of data, there should not be a differentiation from one to the other.
Right.
Yeah.
There shouldn't, but there often is, and you just want to make sure it's not that big.
So, to that end, it really boils down to like, do you need something else from somebody else, like hosting service, or is it better to just be clear of that with a place like OP3, where you're potentially, like, if you do end up switching hosting platforms at some point, you're then also not having to switch all this other information as well.
Right. Absolutely. And that's what we're really trying to do. And that is a really good point, because like in our service, we could just turn off all third-party analytics preferences and just go with what we are currently getting through our provider. IAB certified, it's good data. But again, if you have any interest in a reference check, having multiple services looking at your downloads is useful.
Yeah, it definitely helps. Huh. Well, this is a good bit of information to learn about. I am curious more about Spotify for podcasters, and I'd be curious to know, like, what are they doing, and like, what is Apple Podcasts, like, what are they offering, like, how are they providing tools for podcasters, and maybe this is room for a future conversation. Like, what are they doing to draw people in, and are there parts of it that make sense in some capacity?
Yeah, I mean, we often go back to the products at, say, Apple, for example. Now, Spotify does something very similar to turn on, membership podcasts through Apple, because, you can, if people who are just use Apple Podcasts as the app, it surfaces to them banners that say, hey, do you want more from this podcast? Click here and you'll get the extra bonus episodes. The challenge is Apple locks you into their service, and it doesn't let you do things like connect to Discord and give you community features. They just want you to stay in the app, and they don't want you to leave that app. Yeah. And that's a thing that has been a real blocker for us to investigate further. But I do think it's worth that conversation. And to dive into what Spotify for podcasters looks like now, because it has changed a lot, particularly over the last year, as they continue to become a more insular platform, and yet offer podcasters who do commit to that platform, some interesting tools.
Yeah, for sure. Very interesting.
I am much less depressed today than I was when we got the email on Friday.
Well, good. I look forward to exploring this. And, as we said, it's definitely something that we need to handle sooner than later. So I definitely want to kind of find out what the answers are going to be and start taking those steps.
It's all in the checkbox, man. It's all in the checkbox.
Excellent.
Thanks, everybody, for hanging out with us. It's always fun to talk about podcasting with you, at you, toward you. And let us know if you have any questions. You can write to us at shows@truestory.fm. We would love to hear from you. On behalf of Andy Nelson, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll see you next time right here on the Podcast, a podcast about podcasting from True Story FM.